But China can take Millie and the United States by surprise. And that's why we need to make sure that we understand what China is saying. Because for decades, we have ignored what Beijing has said about the United States, as we ignored what Osama bin Laden said about us. And of course, we know the history and the sad history. On one day, 2,977 Americans were killed. And we can't say we weren't warned, but we can say that we decided to be oblivious.
Hardly a week passes without hearing something about China and how its leaders are doing something to push back on the United States. This week, it was a little bit of mixed messaging, sending warships on the high seas, while members of Congress are meeting with the president of Taiwan. Yet on the other hand, they're also trying to negotiate a peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine. Hard to see a clear agenda, so Gordon Chang is joining us now to help us explain why. Gordon, do the Chinese really think that we shouldn't be talking to the leaders of Taiwan?
They certainly feel that, Rob. And right now, they're going to do, I think, a number of things. One of them is this Fujian Provincial Maritime Administration has declared a 3-day exercise. They call it navigational safety, but they say they're going to board ships near Taiwan. Now, if the United States has had a consistent foreign policy over 2.5 centuries, it has been the defense of freedom of navigation. This is a direct challenge to the United States and, of course, to President Biden. And we will see whether Biden submits to this or not. But this is going to be critical.
So this is in direct reaction to McCarthy meeting in California with the Taiwanese president?
Yes. And they've been talking about this in propaganda for quite some time, about how this is completely unacceptable to Beijing. And we have heard them ramp up the rhetoric. But now with the military exercises and with these navigational safety exercise, this is going to get serious. When Speaker McCarthy announced this, that was important. But this comes, of course, on the heels of Nancy Pelosi, then Speaker in August of last year, going to Taipei to meet President Tsai Ing-wen. So Beijing is starting to see a pattern, and they understand that if they don't act, this will just become something that they will not be able to deal with. So they've decided to deal with it now.
So China said today in response to Taiwan meeting with the U.S. that there would be a resolute response. Was that it, or is that forward thinking, like you better watch out, something else is coming?
We'll find out. But clearly, if they're going to be boarding ships, that is one of the most provocative things that they can do. Now, they can do other things as well, but we need to be prepared. We have a Pentagon that is not mentally prepared to deal with China. We can tell it from the words, for instance, from Chairman Milley, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who doesn't think that there is an imminent threat of anything. But China can take Milley and the United States by surprise. And that's why we need to make sure that we understand what China is saying. Because for decades, we have ignored what Beijing has said about the United States, as we ignored what Osama bin Laden said about us. And of course, we know the history and the sad history. On one day, 2,977 Americans were killed. And we can't say we weren't warned, but we can say that we decided to be oblivious.
If they invade Taiwan, and let me ask you, do you think it's inevitable that they will? Do you think China understands the chain reaction that will happen from around the world, the response?
Yeah, I don't think anything is inevitable, but I do think that war between China and the U.S., which could be over Taiwan or could be over something else, will happen unless something changes. And right now, the drift towards war is picking up speed. In terms of what Beijing understands would be the consequences, I think that they have some sense of that because they've been trying to sanction-proof their regime. So they understand that the international community will take actions. But I think that they actually believe that they can get away with it because they believe they're China. And at the end of the day, nobody, they believe, is going to want to be on China's bad side.
So what would need to change in order to lower the flame?
What needs to happen is President Biden getting behind his desk in the Oval Office in front of a TV camera and saying, we will defend Taiwan. we will offer Taiwan a mutual defense treaty. We will pre-position supplies on the island, something we didn't do with regard to Ukraine. We will put a tripwire U.S. force there like we have in South Korea. We will make sure that China understands that it must not invade Taiwan. We haven't heard words like that, and we have not seen the administration take those actions. Now, of course, no previous administration has taken those actions either, going back to Carter. But the point is, this policy that we have had on Taiwan has only worked in a benign period, and we are no longer in a benign period. So the president must take actions that once were considered to be extreme, but which I think right now are necessary.
Let's shift over to Ukraine, obviously Russia and China. Apparently China is trying to reach some sort of agreement, peace agreement with those two countries. Would the U.S. be okay if they were able to do that?
Not according to China's 12-point plan that was released on February 24th, because that calls for a ceasefire and keeping forces in place. And as John Kirby, the National Security Council comms director, said, look, that would leave Russia in possession of Ukrainian territory. And that, to the credit of the Biden administration, is unacceptable. So I don't believe that a ceasefire is in the interest of Ukraine. It's not in the interest of the international community. And the reason is, if we allow Russia to retain Ukrainian territory, that's a big green light to China, to North Korea, to Iran, to Algeria, to go against their neighbors. And that, of course, means global conflict.
Let's talk about the currencies. 87% of world trade is done in the U.S. dollar, only 3% in the Chinese yuan. But they're trying to change that equation. And what is their agenda in trying to bolster the Chinese currency around the world?
They do not want the U.S. dollar to be the world's reserve currency. They want the renminbi to be. Now, they know they can't do that because the renminbi is not convertible on the capital account. And as a practical matter, it's often not convertible on the current account either. Also, for a currency to be considered a reserve currency, to be freely used and accepted around the world, people have got to accept that the currency will be administered fairly. And nobody really expects the People's Bank of China to fairly administer the renminbi for the good of the world. And that's why it's going to be very hard for them to make too much headway. They can get, for instance, this agreement with Brazil, where they will trade in Brazilian real and the Chinese renminbi for trade between the two of them. But Brazil will only accept as much renminbi as they need to buy goods from China. They're not going to be taking large amounts of it because the renminbi is weak anyway, and no one wants a weak currency.
Well, Gordon, we appreciate your thoughts on something that's really dangerous and troubling with what China's actions are around the world. So thanks for coming on Centerpoint again.
Thank you so much, Rob. I appreciate it.